All right. Okay, so we're going to continue on here. So where we ended last was how, because of the Enlightenment, along with, the witch trials and, that went on prior to that, beginning in the 1400s, going into the 1700s, and then we have the rise of the Enlightenment. We find at this time period, secret societies started to get established, the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons. Well, what happens next here is things get further developed in terms of the Western esoteric tradition. And so some important people introducing some key ideas that become very influential, we need to cover here as things continue. And the next key figure we need to talk about here is Emanuel Swedenborg. Okay, let me just expand this a bit here. Emanuel Swedenborg. And he was, and this is of course in Sweden, he was his father was a chaplain, all right, to the King of Sweden, and his father was also the dean of the university. And Swedenborg himself was deemed to be quite the genius. He was an inventor and a scientist, and he wrote over 30 books. First, very much focused in all the sciences in various ways. And I'm going to just show a little video clip here in a sec. And after having done all of these books and research in terms of every field of study you could imagine, from the earth sciences to human anatomy, he explored the nature of the beginnings of the universe and invented all kinds of things. He then hits a period in his 50s where he enters into a bit of a spiritual crisis. And over a series of dreams, he gains a strong sense of guilt before God and a sense of being rebuked for his pride, being highly intelligent, highly creative, having written and researched a lot. He, was sort of got a message from God that, woe unto you, you need to be more humble. And this eventually led to his seeking God more sincerely in some way. And then he started to have powerful visionary experiences. And it seems that these visionary experiences were pretty intense. So there's descriptions of him being in an inn as he's traveling. He's at an inn where he's getting some food and sitting at a table. And this man appears in front of him, sits at the table, and introduces himself as Jesus Christ, as the Lord Jesus, and speaks to him and tells him that it is his mission to reveal to people the truer, deeper, more spiritual meaning of the Bible, all right? And this sort of blows them away. And then this person just disappears somehow. And then the next, he's in his room where he's staying at the inn. And again, this being appears into his room, again as the Lord Jesus Christ, telling him that indeed he is being called. It is his mission to bring to people the deeper, truer meaning of the Bible, of the scriptures. And this would be revealed to him, and he's to write this stuff down. And so this begins where for the rest of his life, he has these powerful visionary experiences. And these visionary experiences where he travels into the spirit world, into other dimensions and realms, and has a vision of what heaven is like, what hell is like, what the spirits on the other side are like, and has all these amazing, powerful visionary experiences, conversations, and visions. And he writes about them all and puts them into and publishes them into all kinds of books, right? This is what happens to him. And so he held that these visionary experiences and the teachings that he's receiving, that they are to become the doctrines, the teachings for a new church. And it represents the beginning, the launching of, today we used to use, the phrase the new age, but the beginning of a new era in human consciousness, a whole new understanding of religion and spirituality that is to come forth from this, right? And in fact, in one of these experiences, he claims that he had and saw and was present to the day of judgment, and that it's not what people think. On this day of judgment that he witnessed in a spiritual sense in the heavenly realms, it took place actually, I think it was in 1757. I think I have that on the next slide. Do I have it? Yeah, 1757. He has this vision of this last day of judgment, and that this was an event in the heavenlies right, in the spiritual world, where evil and misperceptions and ignorance has been kind of removed and judged by God, right, and sort of cleared out. And that now, as a result of this day of judgment, there's going to be a new spiritual consciousness that's going to be awakening and spreading throughout the earth. All right, that sort of a spiritual influx is going to happen. And this is going to lead to, again, using theological language, the birthing of a new Jerusalem. And here, Jerusalem in the Christian tradition here represents sort of the city of God. And it's a metaphor for God's rulership, God's kingdom, that the ways of God would be more established on earth, that there would be, as a result of these revelations and this shifting in human consciousness that would take place. So he has these visionary experiences. And let me just backtrack here, if I can. Okay, there we go. That he receives and he writes about them. And he also had a reputation amongst the people for being somewhat psychic, prophetic, whatever you want to call it. So there's a story of how he was at a dinner with a bunch of people, and all of a sudden he gets up and steps outside, and he looks out into the distance, and he's 300 miles away from Stockholm. But he has this vision and can see clearly that there's a fire happening in Stockholm. And he sees it's burning out all these houses. And it's so close to his house, and he tells the people, oh, there's this fire happening in Stockholm. Well, then they continue with the dinner. And after a while, again, he gets up and steps outside. It has sort of looks off into the distance. And then he comes back to the people. Oh, thank God, the fire has been brought to an end. It stopped just 2 doors down from my house, and he gave specific details of what houses got burnt down, where and what, and where it ended and whatnot, all during this dinner with all these other people. But yet they're hundreds of miles away from this, so there's no way you can see it physically, right? Well, everybody was fascinated by this, and sure enough, the reports came in days later that indeed a fire exactly as he described happened in Stockholm and burned exactly as he described, and validated his visionary experience, right? So much so that, the philosopher Emanuel Kant even refers to this because it really spread. The word just spread amongst the people and became quite widely known of his experience here. And there are other instances like this where, a woman, her husband had died, and a jeweler was trying to get some money from her, and she insisted that she thought her husband had paid for this, but the jeweler or whoever it was trying to swindle her. And Swedenborg had a vision or a sense of where she could find a receipt for the job committed that he had indeed been paid for, that was in some secret drawer in the house where the husband kept things that the wife didn't know. And sure enough, that resolved the case. She found exactly what Swedenborg had described as a secret drawer that kept these receipts that her husband had. So there's all kinds of stories like this about Swedenborg, and he developed quite the reputation amongst the people this way. But he was very much a devout Lutheran. Okay, and here, he was Lutheran. His father was a Lutheran minister, and as I said here, chaplain to the king. He was in the upper class, aristocratic class of society, and had a highly esteemed reputation, so much so that there's a special monument in honor to him in Sweden, honoring his contributions, intellectually and whatnot, and in the sciences as a whole. So what were some key teachings of his? I already mentioned that this last judgment took place in 1757 that will allow for a new influx, a sort of a shifting, spiritual shift on this planet that will allow for a whole different understanding about religion and spiritual things. Okay, new religious orientation is going to begin to unfold on the planet as a result of this. All right, that's key idea number 3. First off, he held that the Christian church needs to understand the Bible in a more allegorical, symbolic way. They need to engage in a more spiritual interpretation of the Bible instead of such a literal one. Okay, this was a key teaching. This is what came to him through these revelations and these visionary experiences that he had gotten. Okay, that's number one. Number two, similar to what we've seen in terms of the Hermetic tradition, he held that there's a correspondence between this material world and the spiritual world. Whatever happens here on earth is going to mirror, reflect what happens on the spiritual plane, on the spiritual level. And that's where point number three comes in, that on a spiritual plane, the last judgment had taken place, that the forces of darkness have been pushed back to allow for a new revelation, a new understanding of religious and spiritual things. That happened spiritually, and now is going to mirror, it's going to unfold physically, materially on earth. Okay, that there's that kind of correlation of things. Okay, it's number two. And number four, this is where he challenges the traditional view in Christianity that you have the one life, and when you die, you either go to heaven or you go to hell. End of story, right? It's very simple, heaven or hell, and it's just those two places. He held from his visionary experiences that it's a little bit more complicated than that, that there are different levels of heavens and different levels of hell, and that where you go to when you die is not eternal, it is not permanent, that you will go to a certain place that will correlate with where you're at in this life. So if you are of a more evil, darker, lower level of being, you will go to more of a hellish place, so to speak, but that's where you're going to be learning your lessons. You're going to be growing through this. And then eventually when you wise up, you will move up to a higher level. Okay, so he emphasized that the afterlife consists of various levels that will correlate with your state of being when you die, and that you will be learning and growing through different levels, and then you move up to the next level, and then to the next level. Okay, so it's not really reincarnation as such, the way it's been traditionally taught in the East, because again, he had no concept of this, right? He's speaking from strictly within a Christian tradition. But he held that what was revealed to him spiritually is that people will always be learning and growing. There's this sense of progress that people will make, that the soul will continue on and journey through different levels. Now, that's a radically new and different idea that he presents here. Right? And he held that this is actually the vision of the afterlife, and so it's quite different from the traditional classic Christian teaching. And then lastly, he emphasized that angels and demons are in fact souls of the dead, that they are either good people or bad people. And they're sort of like darker states of being of people, or higher states of being, you know, if they're good people or bad people. And they're like voices. You'll have both voices there. You know, dark ones of wanting to bring destruction, wanting to bring you down, thinking, oh, life is no good. Why even bother? You know, it's, you know, give up on life. Why don't you steal this? Why don't you, whatever? It's just all negative, tempting you to choose evil. And then there's another voice that's always wanting to encourage you and inspire you and, you know, raise you up and say, no, keep having faith, believe in goodness, choose the good, choose what's right, speak the truth, you know, do good. So you have these two forces, and what we have called angels and demons are actually the souls of the dead who are either good or bad people, and they're voices that we'll always be hearing, and we'll always have the choice as to which way we want to go. Okay. So that's kind of how some key ideas that he introduces and presents here that are going to be really worked with down the road, specifically in the movement of spiritualism. All right, spiritualism. And we'll talk more about that, you know, in a future session. Okay. So, whoops. So, where am I here? So he published a huge amount of material. Okay, as I said, already 30 books, and then a lot that was still just manuscripts that weren't published after his death. Just unbelievable what he all produced. And he just had these visions, wrote this stuff. He didn't go around teaching and preaching or anything like that. He just had the material, some of it being published. So what happens is that his material gets published, people start reading it, and over in England, his teachings were so well received by a circle of people that they decided to hold regular meetings based on his teachings, and they decided to create a new type of church, a new denomination within Christianity, okay? And they called it the New Jerusalem Church that got established in London. And so it's then from there, some of these people then migrated over to America and the new colonies established in America, and they bring Swedenborg's ideas there, getting established in Baltimore, okay? And so I just want to now play just a quick little video. I'm going to pause. Hang on here. Now, I'm going to share. Let me just kind of go here. This is one. And
of the New Century edition of the works of Emanuel Swedenborg. So maybe you've heard or read something interesting about this Emanuel Swedenborg, and you want to know more. Well, perhaps the most basic thing you should know, just for purposes of light conversation, is that Swedenborg was an 18th century Swedish scientist, philosopher, and theologian. Born 1688, died 1772. The next thing you should probably know is that he was brilliant. He was what people call a universal genius, a polymath, a Renaissance man, ahead of his time. For instance, he was a submarine designer before there was such a thing, a psychologist 140 years before Freud, an aeronautical engineer 190 years before the Wright brothers. He was a mathematician, geologist, metallurgist, mineralogist, crystallographer, anatomist, botanist, chemist, physicist, cosmologist, astronomer. I'm not making this up. This is very well documented. He was an author, inventor, legislator, mining engineer, economist, editor, a poet, and a musician. He came up with the first rational design for flight and made anatomical discoveries that were well ahead of their time. He published 14,000 pages and left another 28,000 pages in manuscript. So he was one of those types. But perhaps the most important but also controversial thing about him was that he claimed that in his mid-50s he had a spiritual awakening that opened the afterlife to him while he was still alive in this world. He was not just alive, but functioning with indefatigable energy. You could think of him as having a near-death experience that went on for 29 years while he was living his daily life, seeing friends, participating in the Swedish government, and writing more books. After his spiritual transition, he wrote and published 25 volumes that contained 3.5 million Latin words. Why Latin? Because it was the equivalent then of English today. It was the most universal language at the time. He wrote and published with an urgency because he had a message for the whole human race. What he wrote draws on the Bible, reasoning, and his own spiritual experiences to present a refreshing take on Christianity and spirituality. His works give unique perspectives on the nature of God, the spiritual world, the Bible, the human mind, and the path to salvation. They've been a source of inspiration to many great thinkers and artists since. So where in all those volumes, that embarrassment of riches, is one to start? Here are
stop sharing that. Okay, so now go back just a little briefly to Google Chrome. Okay, that's where it is. And but I want to, I know that's what I want to do. Okay, go back to this one. Okay. So as I mentioned, some of these come into America, right? And this will become important, as you'll see shortly. And a key figure that gets influenced here by Swedenborg is Johnny Appleseed. Okay, Johnny Appleseed. You may have heard of him in terms of American folklore. He's actually John Chapman was his name. He was an orphan, known as sort of an American saint, a friend of the Indians in the sense that the indigenous people, he embraced them, he became a part of them, he was very much in harmony with them, and really was quite different from most people by being really almost like a nature mystic, you know, close to the animals, close to the land, close to the indigenous people. And he developed an apple seed business where he would go around selling apple seeds to all within the colonies. And as he did this, he would leave pamphlets everywhere he went that summarized a lot of Swedenborg's ideas. And he always referred to them as the good news fresh from heaven, like the latest, you know, revelations from heaven. Okay. And the teachings of Swedenborg then came to play a key role in spiritualism, which is going to be a new movement that will be developing in the United States, where people are going to start contacting the dead and getting messages from the other side, from the afterlife. Just as Swedenborg had visions of heaven and hell and the afterlife, there are those who are going to develop the ability to communicate with the afterlife. And that's where spiritualism will develop, right? So anyways, I'm going to just end there for today. And yeah, and we will pick up on some more important people and ideas shortly. Okay. All right. Oops, I'm going to end.